Tonight's Stephen Colbert show spiraled into chaos as rising political star Karoline Leavitt clashed with Colbert himself, turning a lighthearted interview into a brutal war of words, with tensions boiling over in front of a stunned live audience. When the opening credits of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert faded out, there was an electric buzz in the studio that was impossible to ignore. Stephen Colbert, always sharp and quick-witted, gave the audience his signature smirk before introducing his guest, Karoline Leavitt, the youngest person ever to hold the title of White House press secretary. The applause was polite but cautious, a visible reflection of the divided opinions swirling around her since she took the position. Karoline walked out confidently, her crisp white suit almost gleaming under the studio lights. She was composed, smiling in that polished political way that suggested she was prepared for a few tough jabs. What she was not prepared for, however, was the storm she was about to step into. Stephen welcomed her with a handshake that looked normal to the cameras, but felt icy in person. You could tell from the first exchange this wasn't going to be a charming late-night chat sprinkled with softball questions. "So, Karoline," Stephen said, his tone already dipping into that sharp, satirical edge he was famous for. "Congratulations on becoming the youngest press secretary in history. Tell me, how does it feel to be responsible for spinning some of the most controversial policies we've seen in decades before you can even legally rent a car in some states?" The audience laughed, but there was an uncomfortable undercurrent. Karoline's smile tightened, but she kept her composure. "Well, Stephen," she said smoothly, "I would argue that it is not about spinning anything. It is about communicating clearly with the American people. Maybe if the mainstream media did their jobs properly, I would not have to work quite so hard." The crowd let out a collective, "Oh," and Colbert raised an eyebrow, his hands clasped together as if restraining himself from clapping back too early. "Oh, I see," Stephen replied with a mock seriousness that barely disguised his irritation. "So the reason people are upset is not because of, say, controversial executive orders or certain Supreme Court nominations. It's because journalists like me are just not doing a good enough job translating the fairy tales you tell?" The air stiffened. You could hear a pin drop. Karoline leaned forward, her voice steady but colder now. "If you are suggesting that facts are fairy tales, Stephen, it says more about your relationship with the truth than it does about mine." The tension was thick enough to slice with a knife. There was no warm banter, no easing back into a neutral place. Both were locked in, and neither had any intention of backing down. The interview stumbled forward as Colbert tried to pivot, but the energy was off. Each question he asked seemed laced with sharper thorns, and Karoline was striking back, harder with each answer. He brought up controversial moments from recent press briefings, evasive answers about foreign policy, contradictions regarding economic statistics. But Karoline met each accusation with bulletproof deflections, seasoned well beyond her years. "You keep dodging," Stephen said at one point, throwing up his hands. "It is like debating a smoke bomb. I ask you about unemployment numbers, and suddenly you are ranting about cancel culture." Karoline's smile returned, icy and poised. "Maybe if you stopped asking loaded questions, you would get more direct answers." The audience was clearly divided. Some cheered, some booed, but all were leaning forward, totally hooked. Then Colbert went in for a hard hit, referencing a recent gaffe where Karoline had misstated key facts during a live briefing, an incident that had been ruthlessly mocked online. "Now, let us talk about last Thursday," Stephen said, pulling out a cue card, "when you claimed that the economy had never been stronger, despite actual recession indicators flashing red. Was that a calculated lie, or were you just misinformed?" There was no grin this time. He was serious. The studio, once lively, had turned eerily still. Karoline's eyes narrowed. "First of all, that comment was taken out of context by bad faith actors. Second, if you want to talk about lying to the American people, Maybe we should start by asking why people like you selectively report what fits your narrative while ignoring anything that doesn't. The audience gasped, unsure whether to applaud or recoil. Colbert leaned forward, his voice quieter but far more lethal. Karoline, do you realize that when you speak like that, you are not defending truth? You are defending propaganda? And for the first time, Karoline's facade cracked, just slightly. Her jaw tightened. She knew she could not let that accusation stand. You have some nerve lecturing anyone about propaganda, she snapped. You are a late-night clown masquerading as a journalist. Your whole career is built on twisting facts to entertain an audience too lazy to think for themselves. The insult hung there, vibrating in the thick, heavy silence that followed. Colbert's smile dropped completely. No snark, no comeback yet. Just pure, visible anger simmering beneath the surface. The energy shifted dramatically. The live audience, sensing the escalation, went from laughter to sheer anticipation. Everyone knew something was about to explode. It was not a question of if, but when. Stephen leaned back slowly, almost theatrically, folding his arms across his chest. Well, if I am a clown, he said coolly, then tonight you just climbed into the car with me, willingly. Karoline opened her mouth to fire back, but Stephen cut her off, turning sharply toward the camera. And we are just getting started, he said, his voice low but unmistakably dangerous. The audience roared, not with laughter, but with a raw, chaotic energy that buzzed through the room like static electricity. The screen faded to black for a moment, but everyone knew this was far from over, and when they came back, all hell would break loose. As the show returned from its short transition, the camera panned over the audience. There were few smiles left. The room buzzed with a low, chaotic tension, almost like a live wire was hanging loose in the middle of the studio. Stephen Colbert sat still in his chair, a cold determination etched into his face. Karoline Leavitt mirrored him, sitting upright, hands folded in her lap, her smile now gone, replaced with a thin, defiant line. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The silence stretched, tightening the noose around the atmosphere. Then Colbert leaned forward. So, Karoline, he began, his voice calm but his words razor-sharp. You said I twist facts for a lazy audience. I assume then you are here to correct the record. So let us start small. Would you care to explain why your administration is telling Americans the border is secure when we are seeing record crossings? The crowd erupted in a mixture of gasps and applause. Karoline's eyes flashed. She was ready. The border is more secure now than it was under the previous administration, she said, voice steady but forceful. We are working with partners across the region. We are addressing root causes of migration. But of course, none of that makes for a good punchline on your show, does it? Stephen's mouth twitched into something between a grimace and a grin. Working with partners, he echoed mockingly. Right. That is why we have towns declaring states of emergency, Karoline shot back without missing a beat. Maybe if Congress stopped playing political games and passed real reform, we would not have this issue. Colbert clapped his hands together once, loudly, the sound echoing through the set. Ah, there it is! The magic trick! Always someone else's fault. The audience burst into a wave of laughter, though some boos were peppered in. The room was no longer just spectators. They were participants now, surging with every blow exchanged on stage. Karoline stiffened. You are proving my point, Stephen. You are not here for the truth. You are here for the theater. Stephen's smile hardened. And you are not here for answers. You are here for damage control. The studio was pulsing. The confrontation had pushed past the polite boundary of interview versus guest. This was now a duel, and neither intended to back down. Colbert pressed on, not giving her room to pivot. Let's talk about freedom of speech, he said sharply. You stood at the podium last month and accused protesters of being, and I quote, threats to democracy, because they criticized your boss's policies. How exactly does calling dissent dangerous align with democratic values? Caroline's face darkened. She knew this was a trap, but walked into it anyway. We support peaceful dissent, she said. But when misinformation spreads, it endangers lives and destabilizes the country. Misinformation according to who? Stephen pounced. According to a government that thinks any criticism is fake news? The crowd was getting louder. People were shouting now, some cheering, some booing. The energy was boiling over. Caroline's composure cracked just slightly. Her voice rose. Misinformation like what you are doing right now, she snapped. Cherry-picking quotes, taking things out of context, creating outrage so you can get your little claps and laughs. Stephen leaned forward, his fingers stabbing the desk. You are the spokesperson for the most secretive administration we have had in years. Transparency is a joke under your leadership. And you dare accuse me of misinformation? The audience was roaring. Security at the edge of the stage had subtly shifted forward, sensing how volatile the energy had become. Karoline shook her head in disbelief, laughing bitterly. You are a partisan hack hiding behind jokes, she said. You think you are brave because you sit behind a desk and throw stones at people who actually have to govern. You have no idea what real leadership looks like. Stephen's expression tightened. And you think leadership is lying with a straight face because you are too scared to tell the American people the truth. They were no longer pretending to have a conversation. They were taking turns swinging at each other, the blows verbal but no less brutal. Colbert, sensing he had the momentum, decided to push even harder. Tell me, Karoline, he said, his voice dropping dangerously low. When you look in the mirror at night, do you honestly believe you are helping this country? Or are you just cashing your paycheck and telling yourself a pretty story to sleep better? Caroline's face froze. There was a flicker of something, maybe anger, maybe genuine hurt. But it was gone almost instantly, replaced with cold fury. You think you are some moral authority? She said, voice shaking with rage. You sit up here on your throne and judge everyone else while pandering to Hollywood elites and out-of-touch ideologues. You do not represent America. You represent a bubble that is too smug to realize it is popped. The words landed hard. The room went dead silent for half a beat. Stephen stared at her, jaw clenched. Then he spoke, each word slow and deliberate. Maybe I am in a bubble, he said. But at least I am not lying to myself about it. The tension snapped like a rubber band. Karoline leaned forward close enough that if Stephen reached out, he could have touched her. You invited me here to ambush me, she hissed. You do not want a conversation. You want a villain. Well, congratulations, Stephen. I hope your ratings were worth it. The audience was stunned into silence. Stephen opened his mouth to respond, but the stage manager was already frantically motioning from behind the cameras, signaling to wrap it up. Time was running out. Karoline stood up abruptly, tossing her microphone onto the chair. I do not need to be part of this circus, she said, turning to walk off the set. The crowd gasped. Some cheered. Others shouted at her to stay. Stephen sat back, watching her leave with an unreadable expression. But just before she reached the curtain, Colbert spoke one last time, loud enough for everyone to hear. Running away fits the brand. Karoline stopped in her tracks. Slowly she turned back around, her face burning with rage. You want me to stay? She spat. Fine. Let's finish this. Security hesitated at the edge of the stage. Producers were shouting into headsets. The audience was on their feet, some chanting, some screaming, the entire studio a boiling, chaotic mess. Karoline marched back to her seat, refusing to be the one who walked away first. Stephen adjusted his chair, his knuckles white as he gripped the desk. This was no longer an interview. It was a battlefield, and nobody, not Stephen, not Karoline, not the stunned crowd, could predict what was about to happen next. Karoline lowered herself back into the guest chair slowly, her jaw tight, her hands gripping the arms of the chair like she was ready to bolt forward at any moment. Stephen watched her with a cold, almost clinical expression, as if he was sizing up an opponent in a chess match rather than hosting a late-night talk show. The band, usually quick to play a few comedic notes to break tension, sat in complete silence. Even the camera operators seemed reluctant to move too much, afraid of triggering the live grenade sitting between the host and his guest. Stephen broke the silence first. "So, where were we?" he said, his voice light but dripping with venom. "Oh, right. You accusing everyone who disagrees with you of living in a fantasy land." Karoline did not flinch. "I accused you of manipulating the truth to fit your narrative, and judging by the way you are reacting, I hit a nerve." The crowd stirred again, a ripple of voices rising. Some shouted encouragement for Karoline, others hurled insults. A live taping had morphed into an uncontrolled battleground. Stephen leaned forward again, elbows on the desk, eyes locked onto hers. "Tell me, Karoline, since you seem to have all the answers," he said, voice low and dangerous. "What exactly is your administration doing right now to fix the economy, besides offering strongly worded statements and photo ops?" Karoline's mouth tightened. "We have passed legislation to invest in infrastructure, to create jobs, to lower prescription drug prices," she said crisply. "But of course, you and your media friends are too busy obsessing over scandal gossip to cover any of it," Stephen snorted, leaning back in his chair like he could not even be bothered to hide his disdain. "Oh, right, the magical infrastructure bill," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Because Americans struggling to buy groceries are just thrilled that there's a new bridge opening in Delaware." A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd, but it was strained, forced, almost uncomfortable. Karoline sat straighter, her eyes flashing. "If you cared about real people," she snapped, "you would stop pretending that every serious effort is a joke just because it does not fit your personal brand of snarky cynicism." Stephen's smile dropped completely. His voice came out colder, sharper. "And if you cared about real people," he said, "you would stop standing at that podium and telling them everything is fine while their lives get harder every day." The words hit like a hammer. For a second, Karoline just stared at him, her face unreadable. Then she laughed. Not out of humor, but out of disbelief. "You have no idea what people outside your little bubble actually live through, Stephen," she said. "You think you are some blue-collar hero because you make jokes about politicians. You are just another millionaire living in Manhattan, pretending to be a man of the people." The crowd gasped again, the line hitting harder than anyone expected. Stephen's face darkened. "I grew up in South Carolina," he said quietly, but with a bite. "I know exactly what struggle looks like, and I know exactly what a con artist sounds like too." Karoline's eyes narrowed. "Save the sob story. You sold out the second you realized outrage made you rich." For a few long seconds, neither of them moved. They stared each other down, the stage lights glaring hot overhead, the air between them heavy enough to choke on. Stephen leaned in again, even closer than before. "You call me a sellout," he said, his voice like ice. "You work for the most corporate, sanitized, pandering administration in modern history. You do not speak for the people. You speak for donors and lobbyists who would not spit on a working-class American if they were on fire." Karoline bristled, her whole body coiled like a spring. "At least I stand for something," she shot back. "You stand for whatever gets. You applause from the same crowd who think patriotism is a punchline." A section of the audience erupted in applause for her, but it was quickly drowned out by loud boos. The crowd was fracturing completely now. No more polite theater, just chaos. Stephen shook his head slowly. "You know what the saddest part is?" he said, his voice almost quiet now. "You're smart. You could have done real good in this country. Instead, you chose to be the mouthpiece for people who see the truth as a threat." Karoline's voice broke through sharp and cutting. "And you chose to be a coward," she said, "hiding behind jokes so you never have to admit you are just another puppet." The room exploded. Shouts echoed off the studio walls. Security stepped onto the stage, not intervening yet, but close enough now that both Stephen and Karoline could see them out of the corner of their eyes. The producers backstage were frantically signaling, trying to figure out if they should cut to black, to commercial, to anything. But Stephen waved them off with a single, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He was not done. "You know what, Karoline?" Stephen said, standing up from behind his desk. The audience quieted instantly, sensing the shift. "You are right about one thing." Karoline stood too, refusing to be looked down on. "And what's that?" she said, her voice steady, daring him. Stephen stared at her, jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides. "That this isn't a conversation anymore," he said. "It's a spectacle. And I'm not going to let you use this stage to peddle lies. 1 second longer." Karoline took a step closer, her voice rising, cutting through the air like a blade. "I am telling the truth," she said fiercely. "You just cannot handle hearing it." Stephen shook his head, almost laughing in disbelief. "The only thing you are telling is whatever your handlers told you to memorize before you walked out here," he said. "And if you think I am going to sit here and let you turn my show into a press conference for your administration's failures, you are dumber than you look." The audience gasped. The deepest gasp of the night. Karoline's face burned red, her hands trembling at her sides, her eyes locked onto Stephen's, with a look of pure, unfiltered hatred. "You have no right," she said, her voice shaking, "to insult me after ambushing me like this." Stephen stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "And you," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "have no right to be here anymore." For one long, agonizing moment they stood there, inches apart, the weight of the confrontation, pressing down on everyone watching. Then Stephen turned to the stage manager. "She's done," he said, his voice carrying through the stunned studio. Security moved in. The crowd erupted into chaos, people shouting, some cheering, some booing louder than ever. Karoline didn't resist as security approached, but she turned to Stephen. One last time, her voice carrying over the bedlam. "You just showed America exactly who you are," she said. Stephen did not respond. He simply watched as she was escorted off the stage. And as the cameras swung back toward him, the host turned to face his audience, his expression grim but unyielding. He had drawn a line in the sand. But the firestorm was only just beginning, as Karoline Leavitt disappeared behind the curtain, escorted off stage by 2 towering security guards. The studio erupted into a frenzy unlike anything the Late Show had ever seen. Half the crowd was on its feet cheering. The other half was shouting in outrage. Camera operators struggled to keep their shots steady. Stagehands stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let the chaos play out naturally. Stephen Colbert remained, standing center stage, the bright lights bearing down on him, his silhouette sharp against the backdrop of the roaring audience. His face was impassive, the adrenaline still thrumming through him, but underneath it all, there was something else, a heavy seriousness that no clever monologue could dissolve. The producers buzzed furiously in his earpiece, throwing suggestions, begging him to cut to commercial, but he ignored them. He knew there was no walking this back. The confrontation had happened, the fuse had been lit, and now the explosion was here. He stepped toward the audience, raising his hands in a gesture for silence. Slowly the noise dimmed, though a few shouts still echoed from the rafters. Stephen looked directly into the camera. "I want to be clear about something," he said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of what had just transpired. "I invite people onto this show to have conversations. Sometimes we agree, often we don't. But what we just saw was not a disagreement. It was an assault on the idea that facts matter." The crowd murmured, a tense, nervous energy vibrating through them. Stephen continued, "We live in a time where powerful people think they can lie boldly enough, often enough, and somehow reality will bend to meet them. I don't care what political party you belong to, left, right, center. This show stands for something bigger than tribal loyalty. It stands for truth. It stands for accountability. And when someone comes onto this stage and tries to bulldoze that, I will not hand them the microphone. The audience burst into applause, a roaring wave that nearly drowned him out, but he wasn't done. And for anyone who thinks this was about shutting down ideas, you are wrong, Stephen said, his voice rising. I believe in debate. I believe in disagreement. I do not believe in letting gaslighting masquerade as leadership. He paused, letting the words sink in. Across the internet, clips of the confrontation were already exploding. Within minutes, social media was ablaze with furious debates. Some accused Stephen of censorship, others hailed him as a hero. Memes flooded Twitter. TikTok was stitched with furious commentary. Every political pundit in the country was scrambling to weigh in. Backstage, Karoline, now off-camera but very much still seething, was speaking into a phone, her face twisted in anger. Word spread that she was already arranging interviews to blast Colbert for silencing conservative voices. Her team would spin it as a moment of martyrdom, fuel for her growing political ambitions. Stephen knew that too. He understood that by kicking her off, he had handed her ammunition. But he also knew he had drawn a boundary that mattered. And in a landscape flooded with carefully curated outrage, boundaries meant something. Turning back to his audience, Stephen softened slightly. "We are going to take a quick break," he said, exhaling a little. "And when we come back, we are going to have some fun. Because frankly, I think we could all use it." The house band struck up a tune. Not the usual playful riff, but a raw, bluesy roar that matched the mood of the room. As the screen faded again, the staff backstage moved quickly to clean up the wreckage. Producers huddled in tense meetings, legal teams discussed fallout, and publicists prepared statements. But Stephen walked calmly to his dressing room unfazed. He knew the headlines that were coming. He knew the smears that would follow, but he also knew that if there was one thing audiences respected, it was someone who refused to back down when it mattered most. That night, as clips of the confrontation racked up millions of views, a new narrative emerged from the chaos. Colbert had not just hosted a show. He had drawn a hard line in an era of soft compromises. Across the country, cable news anchors played the confrontation on endless loop. Some networks painted Stephen as arrogant and intolerant. Others praised him as courageous for standing up against political manipulation. Commentators dissected every word, every gesture, every glare exchanged between him and Karoline. It was messy. It was polarizing, and it was utterly unforgettable. By the next morning, The Late Show was trending #1 worldwide. Opinion pieces flooded the media, arguing over whether Colbert had gone too far or not far enough. But inside his apartment, Stephen sat alone at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, staring out the window into the gray New York morning. Replayed the confrontation in his mind, not as a host, not as a performer, but as a citizen. Had he crossed a line? Maybe. Had it been worth it? Absolutely. Sometimes, he thought, silence was complicity. Sometimes you had to be willing to lose something. An audience, a reputation, a moment, in order to protect something bigger. He took a sip of the cold coffee, wincing at the bitterness, and smiled faintly. He had not set out that night to ignite a firestorm, but when it came, he had not flinched from it either. The world could debate it, spin it, meme it, tear it apart. But for Stephen Colbert, the night Karoline Leavitt stormed off his set would stand as a reminder. In a time of orchestrated falsehoods, telling the truth, even when it cost you, was still an act of defiance worth celebrating. And in that messy, chaotic, brutally honest moment, Stephen had reclaimed what late night, and maybe even America, was supposed to be about all along. Not about applause, not about popularity, but about standing for something when it mattered most. As he turned off the kitchen light and disappeared into the early dawn, one thing was clear. He had not lost the fight. He had defined it.